Welcome to the 40th Annual E.F. Schumacher Lecture. I'm your host, Jodie Evans. I'm from Code Pink Women for Peace and a proud member of the Schumacher Board. This lecture series presents some of the foremost voices on a new economics that supports both the people and the planet. I want to bring into the room some words by E.F. Schumacher to set our stage. Among material resources, the greatest, unquestionably, is land. Study how a society uses its land, and you can come to a pretty reliable conclusion as to what its future will be. From small is beautiful. Today's lecture is entitled Private Sufficiency, Public Luxury. Land is the key to the transformation of society. We are thrilled to listen to this lecture from George Monbiot, who is a British author famous for his environmental and political activism. He writes a weekly column for The Guardian and is author of many books, including Feral, Rewilding the Land, Sea, and Human Life, and Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning. His latest is Out of the Wreckage, a new politics for an age of crisis. George co-wrote the concept album Breaking the Spell of Loneliness with musician Ewan McLennan and has made a number of viral videos, one of them adapted from his 2013 TED Talk, How Wolves Change Rivers, which has been viewed on YouTube over 40 million times. Another on natural climate solutions he co-presented with Greta Thunberg has been watched over 50 million times. He is the founder of The Land is Ours, a campaign for the right to access the countryside and its resources in the UK. I am so pleased to welcome George Monbiot.
How is it possible to own land? I find it remarkable that this basic question is so seldom asked. The current pattern of the ownership and control of land lies at the heart of many of our big dysfunctions. The collapse of wildlife and ecosystems, the exclusion and marginalization of so many people, the lack of housing in many cities, indeed in many parts of the world, the lack of public space in cities, our exclusion from the countryside. The pattern of land ownership is at the heart of all of these massive issues, and indeed many more. And yet we seldom question it. We seldom even talk about it. It scarcely features in public life. Such a grip does the current pattern have on our imaginations that it feels like trespassing even to raise the issue. At the heart of public life, there's this universal, unexamined assumption, which is that the money in your bank account translates into a right to own natural wealth. If you have enough money, you can buy a whole mountain range, a whole fertile plain, a whole section of a city. You can buy as many minerals as you want, as many precious natural resources as you want. That money in your bank account gives you a right, a concomitant right to own the Earth's surface. But why? What just principle lies behind that right? Why does the dollar sign or the pound sign make you a more important citizen than someone who's got less in their bank account? Why can you grab resources whose grabbing deprives other people of the use of those resources? And this applies not just to land, it applies to the atmosphere as well. Why are some people allowed to burn so much fossil fuel? It applies to the stuff which we own. Why are some people allowed so much more than others, depriving us of a habitable planet? It applies to the stuff we eat. Why do some people arrogate to themselves the right to eat a steak every day or rare fish when it's destroying our life support systems? And it does seem incredible to me that we're not asking this question every moment of every day, and yet it's just not there at all. In fact, people are completely befuddled if you put that question to them. If you say, why does money translate into a right to own natural wealth? Most people have never been confronted by that question at all. But those who have often turn in a kind of panic to John Locke, the famous 17th century philosopher, and his second treatise on government, published in 1689. And this second treatise has really become the basis of our property law and indeed of our whole modern economy. And yet, in my view, it's completely mad. So what Locke says is that we establish our right to own natural wealth by mixing our labor with it. If you pick a fruit from a tree, or if you dig a hole in the ground, you own that thing because you have used some of your labor to obtain it. That ground becomes yours because you have dug a hole in it. And this notion of mixing your labor with the land, or mixing your labor with natural wealth, has become absolutely fundamental, even if it's not actually talked about. It's a tacit assumption behind the whole way in which our lives are structured today. And this notion was picked up by the eminent jurist William Blackstone in the 18th century, and with his help and that of many others, translated into law across vast tracts of the world, where basically you can achieve sole domain over a tract of land or another aspect of natural wealth on the grounds that at some point you or your ancestor or the person you bought it from mixed their labor with the land. So let's just examine this notion for a moment. For a start, it assumes a year zero. You could just turn up as the first person who ever arrived, the colonist in other words, on a completely blank slate, a piece of land where nobody had any rights before because there was nobody there. And John Locke's quite explicit on this point. He says, in the beginning, all the world was America. In other words, all the world was empty of people. It was there for the taking. But of course, all the world was America, but not in the sense that he meant, because all the world was occupied before European colonists turned up. And the Americas, particularly so, there were tens of millions of indigenous people who had their own rights in the land, even though they didn't recognize the concept of land ownership in the way that the European colonists do. This idea that you've got a legal title and this gives you exclusive domain and no one else can enjoy the fruits of that land. This was as alien to Native Americans as the idea that we might own the air that surrounds us is to us today. But in order to create that blank slate, which John Locke talked about, that terra nullius, that land without people, those people who lived there had to be cleared from it. And that clearance took the form of genocide. Huge numbers of people killed, many accidentally through disease, but many deliberately through mass murder and expulsion, in order to create that blank slate, in order to create that place where the colonist could turn up as if he, and frankly, it's almost always he, as if he were the first person ever to have stepped onto that piece of earth and to have stuck a spade into it. And in doing so, in sticking that spade in, the colonist is able to annul all previous rights on that land. But not just all previous rights, all future rights as well. Because according to the Lockean doctrine, by mixing your labor with the land once, you and your descendants, or the people who you then sell the land to, have absolute rights in perpetuity to that piece of land. So someone else can't turn up 5 years later, stick their spade in the land and say, hey, I'm mixing my labor with the land is therefore mine. No, you've not only cancelled all prior rights, you've cancelled all future rights by once mixing your labor with the land. But it gets even crazier than this, because it turns out that your labor doesn't have to be your labor at all, but the labor of those whom you employ, the labor which you control. So the person sticking the spade into the ground isn't the person who acquires the rights. The person who acquires the rights is the person employing the person sticking the spade into the ground. And in 1689, when Locke's second treatise was published, If you were to establish large-scale rights, particularly in the Americas, basically you were going to be using slaves. You were going to be using slaves to dig that land and say, I, as a slave owner, am mixing my labor with the land because that is my labor. I own those slaves. So what Locke, maybe purposefully, maybe inadvertently, did was to create a Charter of Human Rights for slave owners. And this is the basis of law, the basis of economic life today. It's basically a series of humongous lies. And the lies are so big and repeated so often and embedded so deeply in the way that we see the world that we don't recognize them as lies, we don't question them, we don't even ask the questions which would lead to us questioning those lies. As a result, the great majority of people on Earth are born on the wrong side of the law. We have this comical concept of equality before the law, and yet a huge tranche of law in every nation is based on property rights. And what that means is that those who own property have far more rights than those who don't. Property law is designed to preserve exclusive rights for those who own against those who don't, to keep those who don't, the have-nots, out of the domain of the haves. And this series of really seizures was created through a process we know as enclosure. And enclosure means grabbing, often with violence, the resources which other people were making use of, which was the basis of other people's livelihood, and then having grabbed those resources, using them as the basis of your exclusive and private wealth. And this process really kicked off in its modern form in England in the 16th century. It then spread to Ireland, then to Scotland, then to the English colonies abroad, and thence to much of the rest of the world. And it is still going on today. Across huge tracts of the land now, there is land grabbing taking place, where local people, often indigenous people, are kicked off the land by big corporations, by states, by private enterprise of all kinds, by private owners, and that land is grabbed and its wealth exclusively concentrated into the hands of the person who has grabbed it. And we see this often accompanied by massive environmental destruction. We've seen the felling of forests taking place across South America, Central America, across Indonesia, and the replacement of those forests and the forest people who live there with monocultures of cattle, of soya, of palm oil, with the replacement of these incredibly rich, irreplaceable ecosystems with monocrops whose purpose is to enrich a very few people. That process continues today. Even in the richest nations, enclosure continues, though by different means, and exclusion continues as a result. So let's take an issue that everybody cares about, housing. Now, in my country, the United Kingdom, it happens that at the moment we have a higher ratio of housing to households than there has ever been. We have a huge amount of housing, but we also have a very large number of homeless people and an even larger number of underhoused people, whole families crammed into flats designed for one person to live in, people sofa surfing, people just about keeping a roof over their heads, even if it's in really squalid and inadequate circumstances. So why should this be? Well, it's because very rich people tend to own a lot of property and very poor people don't own any at all. And those very rich people tend to own multiple homes, second homes, third homes, fourth homes, fifth homes, many of which are left vacant for much of the year. And each of those homes they own has enough room for a big family, maybe more than one family, and yet often are occupied by just a couple or even perhaps by just one person. There's a grossly unequal distribution of housing, and it's becoming more unequal all the time. And that's because the current pattern of land ownership drives a powerful spiral of patrimonial wealth accumulation. If you own property, you can leverage that through the rents you get, through the rise of the value of that property to buy more property. And then you can buy more, and then you can buy more. That spiral just keeps building and building if left to its own devices. It doesn't all work out well in the end unless governments intervene and deliberately break that spiral, primarily through taxation and through regulation. Then we find fewer and fewer people with more and more property in their hands and ever more people excluded as a result. And that exclusion extends to all sorts of aspects of our lives. One of the things that we've discovered during the pandemic is just how important green space is to us. Crucially important to our mental health, our physical health, particularly to that of our children. Children brought up in areas which have plenty of green space generally do a lot better on a whole series of indicators, including mental and physical health, than those who are just surrounded by concrete, hard surfaces everywhere. And yet, despite the fact that even in densely populated nations, there's a great deal of green space, we're excluded from the huge majority of it. In most cities, the provision of parks and green places is woefully inadequate. We find ourselves walking round and round little green cages. In the countryside, even in a country like mine, which prides itself as a great nation of walkers, we're confined to a few footpaths with barbed wire on either side, crossing depressing landscapes, while big estates have enclosed the most beautiful parts of the countryside and built walls around them and put up no trespassing signs all round those. And even though in the UK, we provide £3 billion a year to landowners in the form of farm subsidies, taxpayers' money, we don't get any access to what we pay for except on 8% of the land in England. 92% of the land we're excluded from. And for many people in parts of the country where there's almost no access land at all, there's really no sense of escape from the gridded, managed, human-made landscape that we often feel trapped in. It's also a potent driver of environmental destruction. So again, to stick to my own country, the UK, for a while, very large tracts of land in the uplands, which you would expect to be the great wildlife havens because the land is really too poor for any form of farming. A lot of them in our national parks, again, you would expect these to be ecologically rich places, are used instead for shooting grouse. Now, the grouse is a wild bird, at least in theory, but these grouse moors, which are owned by some of the richest people in the world, not just the very rich aristocrats in the UK, but Russian oligarchs and oil sheikhs and Texas minerals barons, and all sorts of people from around the world. A lot of the time you can't even find out who owns it because it's registered in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands in these secrecy jurisdictions. This land is owned by these big owners exclusively for shooting these little birds, these red grouse. But in order to maximize the numbers of grouse, they systematically destroy the ecology of these great areas of land. They do so by burning them, because by burning the land, you create lots of little green shoots coming up from the heather the next year, which the grouse like to eat. They do so by killing any predator which might eat the grouse, from foxes and weasels and stoats to eagles and hen harriers and peregrines. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's legal or illegal to do it. They will trap them, they will shoot them, they will snare them, they will poison them, and they get away with it because they are effectively above the law. So the pattern of land ownership there has turned what should be extremely rich and vibrant ecosystems into monocultures, effectively upland chicken runs, which are massively overpopulated by red grouse and almost nothing else. And we see a similar pattern all over the world, that the demands of the very few who own large areas of land supersede the demand of the majority who might want that land protected for wildlife, And instead, that land is very often destroyed at the behest of those owners. Now, the Canadian social science professor, Kevin Mackay, points out that when you look at the history of civilizational collapse, you find a very interesting and disturbing pattern, that there is an association with complexity, there's an association with soil loss, there's an association with energy use, but the strongest association of all is with oligarchic control of those societies. When you have a very few people in charge and everyone else excluded from the crucial decisions, such as what you do with the land, those civilizations collapse. And they collapse because what the oligarchs want is not in the interests of society as a whole. It's in their own exclusive interests. And by pursuing those exclusive interests and shutting everyone else out of decision-making, they drive societies to ruin. And that's just what we're seeing today. Now, I've mentioned the foundational lies of our legal system and our economic system. But there's also another huge foundational lie, which could be called the foundational lie of capitalism. And this is the idea that everyone can justifiably aspire to private luxury. That however poor you might be now, however excluded, however marginalized, you have a chance under capitalism of becoming extremely rich and owning a huge amount of natural wealth. In fact, that's the only thing which really allows capitalism to continue, because vast numbers of people are, in a quote misattributed to John Steinbeck, temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We believe that we are going to acquire vast wealth, even if we are at the time very poor. And so we allow this system, which permits a very few people to acquire vast wealth, to continue, even when it's clear that the system is not in any sense distributional, but acts instead to concentrate wealth and make those who already possess it much richer than they are, while ensuring that those who don't possess it scarcely get a look in. But it's that promise that you too could be like those people you see on TV. You too could be like the Kardashians. You too could be like the Koch brothers. You too could be like Donald Trump. You can have a great big gold tower with your name emblazoned on it. You can have a private jet. You can have a huge ranch, a great big country estate. That's the promise on which the whole thing is based. Now, even if capitalism were distributive, even if it did ensure that everybody got a chance, got a look in, that promise would still be impossible to fulfill, simply because there isn't enough place in which it could be fulfilled. You can't all have a ranch or a giant estate or a tower in your own name. You can't all have a private jet and a runway to land it on, because there simply is not enough land. And of course, there's not enough ecological space either. If everybody lived like the very rich, we would cook the planet in a matter of years. It would become uninhabitable, even more quickly than it's becoming uninhabitable at the moment. So this notion that we can all aspire towards private luxury is just fundamentally untrue. So to give you one example, even if you're not going to own your own private jet, if everybody owned their own tennis court and their own swimming pool and their own art collection and their own big garden with play equipment for their children, the city of Newcastle would be as big as London. London would cover most of England. England would cover Europe. Europe would cover the world. There just isn't enough space for everybody to live like that. It just doesn't exist. That space is an illusion. And of course, alongside that illusion comes an even bigger illusion that we can all just continue to grow, that the economy can grow and grow and grow infinitely in a finite planet. And as a result of this illusion, again, to draw on my own country, the United Kingdom, because I've always feel the need to bring these things home rather than just pointing to other nations, we use our global ecological footprint about 5 hectares of land and sea per person per year. And yet our biocapacity in the UK is 1 hectare. In other words, to pursue our rich lifestyles and to pursue as much or as little private luxury as each person has in this country, we need to be taking resources away from other people. We exclude and deprive people in order to live high on the hog today in our own nation. And if everybody tried to do that, well, we would need 5 planets. And clearly, we don't have 5 planets. So we've got to be much more careful about the way that we use the resources that we do have. And that means we can't allow a handful of people to just take more and more and more, excluding everybody else, depriving them of a chance of a good life, and at the same time, destroying our life support systems. Our private luxury deprives other people of their private sufficiency. So what do? Everybody wants a good life. We all want to share in the natural wealth of the planet. We want to share in prosperity. We want to live decently. We don't want to be excluded. We don't want to be marginalized. We don't want to be so poor that we have a rubbish quality of life. But how do you possibly do that if there isn't enough space? Well, there is. There's not enough space for private luxury, but there is enough space for everyone to enjoy public luxury. There is enough space for everyone to enjoy magnificent public parks and public swimming pools and public museums and public tennis courts and public art galleries and public transport, if only we use the space more intelligently. And by creating public space, you create more space for everybody, whereas when you create private space, you exclude the majority of people and create less space for everybody else. And particularly in cities in the poorer parts of the world, you see this profound inequality where huge numbers of people are crammed into tiny living quarters in really squalid and impoverished conditions with no public space at all, with scarcely any public amenities, public transport and the rest. Whereas in other parts of the city, you'll see these enormous villas with huge gardens and their own swimming pools, and huge cars which they fill up the roads with every day. And it's because some people have taken so much that other people have so little. This is a zero-sum game. They stopped making the land long ago. And so if you take more land than is your due, you are excluding other people from that natural wealth. But if we use urban land wisely, and if we ensure that we concentrate primarily on public amenities, on public transport, on public space, on public goods, then we can have public luxury for all. So my catchphrase almost has become private sufficiency, public luxury. So am I saying that vast amounts of land need to belong to the state? No. I mean, I think the state has a very important role to play. It's crucially important for providing education and public health, public transport, for regulating society, for ensuring that some people don't become so big and powerful that they destroy democracy, for ensuring that everybody's got an economic safety net. There's lots of really crucial roles that the state has to play. But if we rely on state provision alone, and if we look to the state to meet all our needs, the state itself becomes too powerful and threatens democracy. Also, state provision alone leads to, I think, a cold, transactional set of relationships. Alongside state provision in the crucial areas, I feel we need much richer and stronger communities. And community power, community strength, comes from something which we call the commons. Now, it seems crazy to me that we have to explain what the commons is, because it's so fundamental to our well-being that everybody should know. But because of the huge lies we tell, and which sit at the basis of economic thought, the very notion of the commons is alien to perhaps the majority of people. A commons tends to consist of three elements. There's a resource, which could be a piece of land, it could be a forest, it could be an internet platform, it could be community broadband, it could be a community energy company, it could be a housing co-op, but it's a resource, a commons, it's the people who manage that resource, and it's the rules and negotiations that those people create to ensure that that resource is well managed. The commons is a distributional system. It ensures that everybody has an equal share either to the resource itself or to the product arising from that resource. It's also a system which tends towards much better environmental protection because the resource which the commoners look after is meant to be inalienable. You can't sell it, you can't give it away, and so you're meant to pass it on to the next lot of commoners, the people who come after you've died, intact, without degrading that. And a classic example, which I benefit from greatly, are the allotments that we have in the United Kingdom, where since the beginning of the 20th century, everyone in this country is entitled, if they want it, to a small patch of land for growing fruit and vegetables. And these patches of land are parts of bigger patches of land called the allotments, run by an allotment association which is controlled by its own members. So you might have 100 or 200 or 300 plots on the allotments, and the members decide how those are to be managed, make sure that they're equitably distributed. Within your own plot, you can do more or less what you want within the broad rules that it creates. But across the allotments, you've got a democracy, and you've got consensus being built through deliberative democracy by the members of the allotment association. It's a classic commons, and it's one which brings enormous benefits to the lives of many people in this country who don't have land of their own. And indeed, by sharing and distributing that land, you make sure that far more people have access to it than the market economy alone ensures, which basically means that only those who are rich enough to buy land have access to land. It's a fair, distributed system. And that's basically how commons work in general. They're not capitalist, they're not communist. They exist in a sphere of their own. It's a different economic dimension. And what we see all over the world is that where commons exist, the general prosperity tends to be greater, societies tend to be more just and more democratic than where those commons have been destroyed. And if you go back far enough, the commons was the fundamental economy. It was the basis of people's economic life. But those commons were seized during the process of enclosure under the Lockean proviso that the person who turns up as a private owner in the commons, as a colonist in the commons, and sticks his spade in the ground is the person who gets to own that land. And it's partly because of the termination of the commons right across the world that we find ourselves in such a fantastic mess in so many ways, economically and politically. So I'd like to see, to the greatest extent possible, a restitution of the commons. And I think this is essential, not just for justice within generations, but also for intergenerational justice. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights tells us that all of us are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, we know that's not true, but even if it were true, within any generation of people born, it's invalidated by the fact that one generation can steal the resources, the environmental resources in particular, on which subsequent generations depend. So, you might all have equality when you're born in this theoretical world created by the Universal Declaration, but it might be equality to share a degraded planet. And what we need to see, I think, added to that declaration is the notion that every generation should have equal rights to the enjoyment of natural wealth. And that, if it were added, would, in theory, on paper at least, change everything. because it would say that no generation is allowed to create a net reduction of the amount of natural wealth. You can't just burn up resources and dump them. There has to be a circular economy. You can't use fossil fuels at all in that case, because you are making the atmosphere less and less habitable. You're destroying the natural wealth of a benign climate, which then destroys people's chances of dignity and rights in the next generation. But what does it say about the land itself? Obviously, if you're born into a situation where some people own almost all the land and the majority of people own none, you're not born free and equal in dignity and rights. And when you get to Article 17 of the Universal Declaration, you see a fundamental contradiction within that article, because it says everyone has the right to own property. But it doesn't set any limit on the amount of property that anyone can own. And so if some people have the right to own property and accumulate more and more property, they mean that other people don't have the right to own property. So the Declaration as a whole makes no sense, because it hasn't considered these issues and because it's based on the false Lockean premise. So perhaps we could add something else to the Declaration, which is that everyone has the right to use property without infringing on anyone else's rights to use property. And that again could change our fundamental relationships with each other and with the land. But how might you bring this about, especially in a situation where those with the land have the law on their side and the money on their side? Well, if I ruled the world, which I will do imminently, if I ruled the world, I would bring about much bigger taxes on the ownership of land. Land ownership is massively undertaxed. It gives you this tremendous amount of wealth for which you don't have to work, and the wealth for which you don't have to work, which is known as economic rent, is the wealth that should be taxed most, but it tends in practice to be taxed least, principally because, even in our so-called democracies, those with the money, to a very large extent, determine the course of politics. So they're not really very democratic at all. They tend to be quite plutocratic. But if we were to impose much higher taxes on the ownership of land, particularly land which is extremely valuable, then we can start using the money gathered by those taxes to buy land. And we buy that land, or rather produce a pot of money with which communities can buy land through the use of a community right to buy. In other words, that the local community and the organizations which it founds to represent itself, in other words, the commons, would have first refusal on any land that came up for sale within the area that community uses as its neighborhood, and would have a pot of money with which to buy that land. It might even have the rights through compulsory sale orders to buy land which has been left vacant or derelict, particularly urban land where there's a desperate need for public amenities or for housing, that the community could then step in and buy that land. And this way, incrementally and slowly, and without any of the violence with which the land was taken from us, we can gradually rebalance this grossly unbalanced situation and get ourselves once more a universal foothold in the land and start to see a democratization of land use and the establishment of that principle of private sufficiency and public luxury. Even that, though, I don't think is quite enough to ensure that the land works for us rather than against us. We need to democratize the decision-making processes that determine how land is used as well. And often these are hoarded by governments, often very vocal people who feel very empowered and entitled, get the greatest say in how the land is used, even during what are purportedly democratic planning processes. So we perhaps need to start looking at planning juries when it comes to deciding what the local plan for your city might be. We could have a form of jury service and co-opting randomly chosen people onto a panel to make the decisions, rather than allowing the big developers to bend the ear of the local authority and say, we want the land used in this way for this purpose because we're going to make a lot of money from it. We need to see perhaps a community participation agency to ensure that far more people are involved in the democratic decision-making process, so people who are usually unheard become heard. I would like to see every local authority all over the world have a future generations commissioner to represent the people who have not yet been born, but whose interests will be very strongly affected by the kind of development which is allowed or not allowed on a particular piece of land. So we see a gradual democratization of the use of land, as well as the democratization of the ownership of land. And I see such proposals meshing with some of the innovative moves which are being made in certain parts of the world. For instance, in Paris, where this very far-sighted mayor, Anne Hidalgo, now talks of the 15-minute city. And I think this is a lovely concept. Initially, it was proposed as a means of solving our massive urban transport dysfunction, where we have horribly polluted cities because a minority of people are using cars to commute because we don't have sensible transport policies. People are also tremendously unfit because instead of using bicycles or walking, we move around in a ton of metal, 1 ton of metal per person. And we have very little public space because a lot of the space which could be used for communities is instead used for parking and for roads. And Anne Hidalgo is trying to address this by saying, let's see this not just as a transport problem, but as an urban design problem. It's not just a matter of what vehicles we're using, it's a matter of why we need to travel so far in the first place, of why people need to go so far to get to work, to get to school, to get to the shops, and all the other things that they might use. And so what she said is, let's divide the city into 15-minute neighborhoods, where within a 15-minute walk, you have all the basic things that you might need. And we create enough local employment that a large proportion of the population of that 15-minute neighborhood actually have their place of work within their own neighborhood. And she sees that not just as a means of addressing Paris's massive transport issues, but of creating much richer and more vibrant and participatory communities, much stronger neighborhoods, where people look out for each other, people are much more likely to know each other, because it's quieter, you can actually talk to each other in the street. The street is a nice place to be. You've got local businesses doing much better, much more embedded, much more of a sense of localism within the community. And on the back of that, she's starting to build in new forms of democratic participation. Because we have, let's face it, a pretty crazy system where a government gets into power as a result of 1 vote every 5 years, which might involve 30% of the electorate voting for that particular party. It might be just 20% of the total population, because of course children and various other people don't vote. And as a result of that, that government can then determine for the next 5 years everything that happens, as long as they continue to command a parliamentary majority. And they can say, well, it was in the manifesto, it was on our platform, therefore we presume we have consent to do whatever we want for the next 5 years. So we presume we have consent for everything we do over the next 5 years. We don't accept the idea of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? A government can say, well, tough, you voted for us. Why can't we modify that decision day by day to actually determine what we want rather than what the government presumes we want? And for that to happen, we need participatory, deliberative democracy. Paris is showing the way. Madrid is showing the way with its Decide Madrid program. Reykjavik is showing the way with its Better Reykjavik program. The Brazilian city of Porto Alegre showed the way with its participatory budgeting, where people have control over how the money that is spent locally is actually used, rather than allowing a small mafia of developers and people close to government to determine it. And that's led to a massive improvement in people's quality of life, better sanitation, better water quality, better primary health care, better education, lower maternal mortality, lower infant mortality, better public transport, you name it. As a result of that program, Porto Alegre went from a really dysfunctional city to being the Brazilian state capital, which was highest on the Human Development Index. And I see no reason why we can't use participatory democracy everywhere to temper representative democracy. Sure, we still need parliament. Sure, we still need local authority. We still need government, but we can also have a far richer political engagement by the people all the time. And a large part of that engagement, I believe, is built on the land. If we have got control over the physical fabric of society, the ground on which we stand, and if we can decide what happens to that ground and how it is used, we can determine that it's used for the benefit of all rather than just the benefit of a few. And we can use that as a basis for the wider democratization of society, the wider protection of our living planet, the wider sharing of the prosperity of our living planet and its natural wealth, not just within generations, but between generations. Let's democratize the land. Let's share the land. Let's use it much better, and let's use the land as the basis for the transformation of society. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, so inspiring. Thank you so much, George. I want to break into a chorus of This Land Is Our Land. So everyone take a minute to take a deep breath and feel the beauty, community, and connection of the commons and the liberation of the land that we just were taken into. And yes, to the restoration of the commons and us being stewards of the land. We would be so much more grounded. So now I want to bring in, for our time of questions, Greg Watson, who delivered last year's 39th annual Schumacher Lecture. Greg is the Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. Greg has spent nearly 40 years learning to understand systems thinking as inspired by Buckminster Fuller, and to apply that understanding to achieve a just and sustainable world. In 1978, he organized a network of urban farmers markets in greater Boston metropolitan area and later served as Commissioner of Agriculture in Massachusetts under Governors Dukakis, Weld, and Patrick. So Greg, let's start with some questions from you for George.
Thank you, Jodie. And George, thank you so much for that inspiring talk. And I must say that the power of dominant narratives sort of came through to me as an important concept. I resonated with your talk, partly because I have a background in community organizing, partly because I'm not wealthy. But I do suspect that there are, even among some of our thousands of viewers of this lecture, you may have hit a sort of exceeded the comfort level of some folks there, because I think what you're saying is really important and very fundamental. The power of the dominant narrative, I think, stems in part from the fact that it's pretty straightforward. It's quantitative. People can grasp what it's all about. The alternative that you laid out so beautifully is more nuanced. It takes, again, it's a more difficult concept to grasp. So my question to you is, how important is it to establish this alternative narrative to replace what, again, the dominant narrative that most people have, I think, just don't even understand, as you pointed out, the assumptions that they're working under. But how important is it to establish and propagate that alternative scenario and who do you target as the most important audience for it in the beginning? And I'm just going to preface this by saying you mentioned the important role that state or governments can play. So as a policymaker, I'm sort of interested in that too. But let me begin with that, with one other caveat. One other caveat, and that is that the private sufficiency argument is important, but I wonder if it could be interpreted by some as saying you're denying me the ability to hedge my bets against uncertainty. That notion of sufficiency, right, is sort of limiting for a number of folks, and that they might see your argument, which is very persuasive to me, about the inability for everyone to enjoy private luxury because of the limited amount of land, could also be a driver for some folks to say, that's why I've got to practice survival of the richest, because I want to get my share before it runs out. So I just pose those to you and ask if you wouldn't mind responding to those as a start.
Thank you very much, Greg. All great questions, really important ones to ask. So if we start with the question of narrative, I feel that as movements around the world, we've been far too slow to understand the crucial role of narrative in driving political change. What we see consistently across successful political and religious movements going back thousands of years is a very effective use of narrative. And interestingly, not just narrative in general, but a particular narrative structure that I call the restoration narrative. And this is a structure which can be adapted to any kind of politics, to any worldview at all, but it's a structure that seems to resonate very powerfully with people if you're trying to reach people in the hope of precipitating political, social, cultural, economic change. And it goes like this. The world has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces exploiting humanity and bringing great harm upon us. But the hero of the story, who might be one person, might be several people, might be an entire community, might be the people of an entire nation, rise up against those powerful and nefarious forces, overthrow them, and restore harmony to the world. That's the Bible story. It's a Harry Potter story. It's a Narnia story. It's the story which comes up again and again in the Lord of the Rings story. We hear it again and again, but it's also the driving force, narrative force of political change. It's the story that John Maynard Keynes told. Conversely, it's the story that Friedrich Hayek told. It's the story that Marx told. It's the story the fascists told. Whichever way you look, it's that narrative framework adapted to their own aims, which of course are wildly different, which attracts people to put themselves in that narrative and say, oh, this change applies to me. It tells me who I am. It tells me how I got here. It tells me how we got here into the state that we're in. But it also lights a path to another world. It lights a path to the future that I see myself as occupying. That's why this restoration narrative, this idea of restoring harmony in a world which has been corrupted and co-opted by evil forces, that's why it resonates again and again. It's resonated for thousands of years across so many generations. And we neglect that role of narrative in political change at our great cost. So I'm very grateful for you for bringing that up, because I feel, one of the reasons that we're so stuck at the moment, apparently so stuck, is that we haven't consciously developed new narratives to get us unstuck. So after the Great Depression, in the early 20th century, John Maynard Keynes sat down and he wrote his general treatise, which was a very powerful and effective restoration narrative, and said, here's our way out. Here's how we're going to do it. And people immediately chimed with that narrative because it fitted that narrative structure very neatly. It exactly fitted it. It was like powerful and nefarious forces of the economic elite grabbed everything for themselves, destroying effective demand. But we, the people, the working class, the middle class people, acting through benign government, will tax those powerful people, use that money to spend it into the economy in the form of public services. In doing so, we employ people, we distribute wealth, we generate effective demand, and we kickstart the economy again. And then when that got into trouble in the 1970s, the neoliberals came forward with almost the exact opposite story, but using precisely the same narrative structure, saying the powerful and nefarious force is the state, and the hero of the story is the freedom-seeking entrepreneur who seeks to overthrow the power of the state by creating an effective market in which, through buying and selling, we liberate ourselves from that powerful force and generate wealth, which will eventually trickle down to enrich everyone. They're opposite stories, but exactly the same narrative structure. Then neoliberalism collapsed spectacularly in 2008, and its opponents came forward with nothing, with no new narrative that fit that structure, and so we're stuck. So and because we're stuck, all these sort of hopeful monsters, these demagogues came in and filled the gap, the narrative gap which we had left. So people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Johnson and Duterte and Erdogan and Orban all over the world, very similar groups of people, because there was political failure. There was a universal, catastrophic political failure because we had generated no new narrative. So if we want to get out of that era, and hopefully we might be beginning to get out of that era, but fingers crossed, if we want to get out of that era, then we desperately, if we're gonna lock in change and start to progress into a different place, we desperately need those new narratives. Now, on the question of people, of course people are going to feel worried by the sort of stuff that I'm talking about, because I think, I've spent my whole life trying to grab my share so that I can secure myself. I can get some security against the extreme insecurity that so many people, the great majority of people in the world, feel and face. And we're in a situation of growing precarity, precariousness. So in environmental terms, precarity has been rising. In economic terms, where we see this great inequality, a small number of extremely rich haves and a growing number of have-nots who find themselves insecure in all sorts of ways. They might not have health insurance, they might not have any economic safety net, and they might not have a firm job, because jobs all over the world have been replaced with contracts, been replaced with the gig economy, replaced with 0-hour working, where you don't know from 1 hour to the next whether you're still going to have work. And so what I would say is that this system in which we each seek our own security, and which we've been promised we will find security, the system we call capitalism, has failed. We haven't found security through it. We've found precarity. A few people have found extreme security, where they can secure themselves against everything. And indeed, they've been buying security condos for when everything goes, as we say in this country, tits up. When if there is a total social collapse, they can stay in their security condos with their armed guards and all their tinned goods and everything else that they need, while everybody else is fighting it out on the toxic wasteland. Or you see these billionaires buying great tracts of land in New Zealand, or trying to build artificial islands in the middle of the ocean and the rest of it to secure themselves. So even they feel insecure. You'd say these are the people who've achieved security through capitalism, but actually they're so insecure that they're having to sort of find their way out, buy their way out, in case everything, as we know it will if we don't change course, goes horribly wrong. So what I would say to people is, look, this dream of buying yourself security, achieving security through private luxury, through private wealth, that bubble has popped, and you can try and cling on to it, but there's nothing left really to cling on to. So, let's look at a way of achieving security for all of us together, where my security does not depend on depriving you of your security, where we achieve a common security based around the commons.
Thank you, George. Appreciate that. And can I follow that up with a question about, I'm intrigued by the allotment program in the UK. Long before I was Commissioner of Agriculture, I was an organizer of community gardens in a group called the Boston Urban Gardeners. And I sort of see the similarity, or at least the closest similarity I can see to what's happening in the UK with the allotment program is our community gardening efforts here in the US. The big difference being that the state has taken the lead in the UK, government has taken the lead, and both, it seems to me, identifying and then allocating land. In the US, or at least in Boston, where I worked, the community gardens were part of the struggle of low-income communities, and was led by organizers, not by the state. And I will say that that was, for at least a good part of the organizing community, a very empowering process. They got to know how government works. They got to know how to make government work for them. So that was a benefit, but it nonetheless was still a struggle. So my one question to you about the UK allotment program is, you mentioned in describing it that it is equitable, democratic. So I'm going to push back on you and just say, does that mean that anyone who would or would like to have a garden in the UK can get a garden? Are there costs involved? Could you just give me a little bit more of a sense of just how the allotment program works?
Thank you, Greg. Again, I'm very grateful for you for asking that and making the important comparison with community gardens. So it arose too out of struggle here. Really, it was, when our land was grabbed by a few big landlords in this country, it wasn't done quietly and it wasn't done smoothly. And there was a massive series of revolts and riots around the country. There were the swing riots. There were a whole load of sort of rick burnings and people pulling down fences and trying desperately to get their land back, because their land was their livelihood. And partly as a result of that, almost as a sop, the government said, "Okay, you can have some land back." Yeah, and so we're going to let you have land. And starting from the late 19th century, from the 1880s. They started giving little bits of land back in the form of allotments. And then in 1908, there was the Allotments Act, which basically said all local government, local authorities have got a duty to provide land for gardening for anybody who wants it. Anyone who wants to grow vegetables or fruit should be allowed a plot of land. And so from that point on, there was in law, there's this legal duty. Unfortunately, what they didn't specify was how long you have to wait to get that land. Yeah. Okay. And so what we find in many communities is, we got allotments, but not nearly enough. And in some places, there's a 20-year waiting list. And so what a group of us have been pushing for is for a change in that 1908 Allotments Act to say within 1 year. Okay. So you actually make sense of that idea of a universal right to a plot. And it's not as if the struggle is over. I mean, it was definitely helped by the fact that we've got the law on our side for once in this case. And so we've all got the right to a plot which is, sized in theory, at least you've got a big enough plot to grow all the vegetables that your family will need. That's the idea. If you farm it quite intensively, garden it intensively, and so it helps a lot that we got that law on our side, but it's still a struggle. Partly because there's not enough land allocated in the first place, but partly because there's constant pressure on that land where councils are saying, well, we're very short of funds. If we sold off the allotments to a developer, we would make lots of money. Now, if an allotment's properly occupied, they can't do it. They're not allowed to do that. They can't sell it off as long as the demand is there. But from time to time, the demand drops. You'll have some generations which are much keener on gardening than others. And there was a drop in demand in the 1980s and 1990s. The old wartime generation who were digging for victory, they had died off. And some of the Windrush generation, particularly Caribbean immigrants who had come to this country who were very keen on gardening, they were getting old as well. And so there were fewer people using the allotments. And it wasn't until really the late 90s that suddenly there was a great resurgence of interest in gardening. And during that time, a lot of allotments got sold off. A lot of people fought to protect them. But the council was saying, well, the Act says we we only have a duty to provide land if the demand for that land is there. And so this takes us back to intergenerational justice.
Yes.
Because what they're effectively saying is, well, right at this minute, the demand for land isn't there. Therefore, under the Act, we can sell off the land. And what we were saying was, but it might be in 10 years' time, the next generation of gardeners might want it. So you're effectively stealing that land from them. It's intergenerational theft. And that's exactly what turned out to be true.
Wow. Thank you. I know there are a lot of questions that people have. I just want to just make one last point for that. The place where the state and at least in Massachusetts has intervened constructively is in its support for commercial farming within the city, urban agriculture, and distinguish between backyard and community gardens. And I think they have made some strong statements. Perhaps one of the most important things they've done, like in the city of Boston, I think city of Somerville, some of our areas here in the greater Boston area, they've rezoned to allow commercial farming within city limits. And as you know, zoning is like that says it's allowable. Without zoning, that's not an allowable activity. So I think we are seeing the consciousness and the understanding, the importance of making land available, particularly for people to be able to meet basic need. Food is critical. So I really appreciate your comments and your efforts in that regard. And thanks for the clarification of the allotment program. Maybe we can get that going as well.
I just realized that I didn't answer one part of your question, which was the amount we pay. Yes. For the plots of land. Sorry, I forgot that bit. And on the association that I'm a member of, it's £25 a year for your plot. In other words, about $30.
Wow. Okay.
So it's basically that money pays for the allotment association for the commons to function, because there's certain things, it has to maintain its shed, it has to send out its newsletters. It's small change. And so, of course, that means it is effectively accessible to everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can find £25.
Love it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you so much. I saw you both, the fingers crossed, and, I don't think fingers crossed gets us there. And so I want to ask a question that our fearless leader at Schumacher, Susan Witt, asked, which is, could you tell us about your Land for Many report and how it can be accessed? Because it isn't fingers crossed it's going to get us there. It's plans. It's kind of what's happening today, that everybody is so stuck in an old way of thinking. We need new breadcrumbs out.
Thank you. Well, I guess from the point of view of everyone else in the world, the US election is fingers crossed, because we should have a vote in it, because it affects us so strongly. We don't. So, but anyway.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people in the street, out working very, very hard.
I know, of course, and absolutely, nothing good ever happens by itself. Good things happen because people are active and people remain active. And in fact, if you go to a neighborhood and it's a nice neighborhood, it's a great neighborhood to live, it's a neighborhood you would want to live there, it's because people have fought for it. It's because people have struggled to make it a good place. And that's, you can almost sort of detect it as soon as you turn up. Good people have expended their energy to make sure that this is a good, equitable, fair, pleasant place to live. So we produced this report called Land for the Many for the Labour Party here in the UK, which sadly did not win the last election. But it's free online. You can find it at our website, which is also called Land for the Many, and download it there. And it's trying to bring back the issue of land into British politics, where it really hasn't featured for about 80 or 90 years. I mean, really, it wasn't until the last time it really showed its face in a significant way in this country was 1911. Maybe it did so a little bit in 1947, but land is just off the agenda. It's quite amazing. This is the most fundamental thing. Nothing can happen without it. We can't float around in the air. Our wealth is literally rooted in it. Our lives are literally rooted in it. But it's like, he who shall not be named. It's so big, it's so important that you can't even name it without instantly being called a communist and all sorts of other things, because of course people feel people who own the land, large tracts of it, feel rightly profoundly threatened by anyone calling for land reform. And what we found when we published this, I mean, it's a very, it took us a year of work. I was the editor of it, but there were 6 experts in different areas working on it, really the top people in the country, a really amazing team of people. And so I think I can say without boasting, because they did most of the work, that this is a really brilliant report. I mean, it is a really, really great report. We did a great job of work on it. And it's balanced, it's subtle, it's nuanced. We didn't just go in and say, right, we want everyone's land. We sort of worked through all the arguments very carefully. There's a lot of really complex stuff in there, complex economics, everything very thought through. We needn't have bothered, because the billionaire press in this country just completely made up what was in the report. They just invented it. They said, they're going to steal your garden. This was all right across the press. We got no good press, but all the billionaire papers, every single one of them was basically they're going to grab your land and they're going to socialize it. They're going to steal your land. They're going to throw you off. All this stuff. They used it to beat up the Labour Party, as they always do. And it's like, but none of that is in our report. We're not saying any of those things. We're talking about totally different mechanisms for reasserting democratic control over land. But I knew that this was the sort of a trigger issue. That's why we don't talk about it, because it is at the root of power. It's at the heart of power in this country and all over the world. Who owns the land and what they're allowed to do on that land? These are questions right at the heart of power. And you touch that heart, and boy, there is an explosion. People go absolutely berserk. And however cleverly you do it, and however thought through and nuanced and well-researched and well-referenced it and well-written your report might be, doesn't make a damn difference. It's just this sort of ferocious, frightened reaction that you get from the big landowners and the billionaire press who supports them, and they just will throw every kind of insult and accusation at you. It sort of made me realize what it must be like to be a Labour politician, because they get this all the time. But land, it was like, okay, we proved land is the important issue, because if it wasn't, they wouldn't be saying this stuff.
Greg, do you want to ask another question?
Sure. And there's a thread that I'm going to just a couple of questions that are really quickly, very similar. So, George, is there a distinction in your view between personal property and private property? Is there any room for individual ownership? And similar, does a shift towards common ownership of land necessitate a shift away from familial connection to land?
Mm-hmm. Both excellent questions, yeah, and really worth exploring. So, I mean, I'm nothing that we've been doing in this report or elsewhere is saying, look, the land that your ordinary house sits on and your small garden sits on, we want to take that from you. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about big owners in either in cities or in the countryside who just have a huge and disproportionate share of our natural wealth, and use that to further to enrich themselves, to rack rent from other people, just because, not through any enterprise of theirs, but just because they've got it and we haven't, and they can charge us fees for the use of it, and to really address those fundamental unfairnesses. And I feel that unless we address those fundamental unfairnesses, then we really have little chance of progressing, little chance of addressing our environmental crisis, our social crisis, our economic crisis. It's we're going to remain stuck. So we have to raise these inflammatory questions and propose, however gentle and careful we are, answers which are by their very nature inflammatory. I've forgotten the second question. Sorry. what was the second one?
Pretty much the same. I just wanted to. They run the same thread, but yeah, I think you've answered actually both of them with that response.
Thank you.
Great. So the next question that we have is, what do you mean by common ground trust? How do you imagine they are organized?
So many thanks for raising that too, and I'm delighted that the questioner must have read our report. So in this, it's a proposal put forward by the very interesting thinker Beth Stratford, who's one of our team, and what she says is look, there's a couple of issues missing in most of the discussion about how to change land relationships. And one of those is that how do you start acquiring land for low-cost housing when land within the city envelope is already almost entirely acquired for higher cost housing, for example. But the other one is, if you're going to start trying to take the heat out of land markets and housing markets, which we're going to have to do if everybody's going to have a decent home, because at the moment, I don't know about where you live, but here in the UK, it's just almost impossible now for young families to get on the housing ladder, for people even on average incomes. Just 20 years ago, to get the deposit for a mortgage, you needed to save on average for 3 years. Now it's 19 years just to lay down a 10% deposit for a mortgage, because house prices have got so high. So somehow we need to take the heat out of that. But at the same time, there needs to be effective demand to make sure we don't trigger a total collapse in house values, which would trigger a total economic collapse. And so Beth has attempted to solve both problems with this proposal for a common ground trust, which effectively says, if you want to buy a home, but you can't afford it by yourself, we, the Common Ground Trust, which is this sort of national agency that she proposes to set up, will buy the land portion, which in this country is like 70% of the cost of a house, and you will buy the bricks and mortar portion, and you will at low rent the land from us while owning the bricks and mortar on top of it. And then eventually what it builds up is a bank of land. So it creates effective demand, because it ensures that people are able to continue to buy homes much more effectively than before. But it also begins to build up a land bank, which it can then start to use strategically to ensure that housing is used for those who need it most, rather than just bought by someone who's already got a house and wants a second home, for example. And it leads potentially to all sorts of other subtle effects, like, for instance, it allows the Common Ground Trust to set up like a rainy day fund. So if someone gets into trouble with paying their mortgage, it can help to tide them over. If someone can't afford even the cost of the bricks and mortar, it can help to give them an extra bit of help to get onto the housing ladder in the first place. So it's got potential. There are issues with it. It's not perfect. We came up with a few things which could go wrong with it, but and perhaps it was the most exploratory of the ideas that we put in the report. But I definitely think it's worth taking further, worth commissioning more research on, to see if it could be an important part of the solution.
So how do you get people to realize that the other has failed, and to accept that a new might have some, tweaking that has to happen? I think we move from failure to the desire for perfection becomes an issue. So people don't even want to walk across the bridge to a new possibility. What do you think gets in the way there?
Things. One, people are afraid of change. I mean, change is scary, but to me, it's much scarier carrying on as we are. Even if you ignored everything else and just looked at the gathering environmental crisis, I mean, the collapse of our life support systems, that's what we're seeing happening in real time. And to carry on as we are is to carry on over the cliff.
That's what real fear is about, as far as I'm concerned. But also, what's scary is seeing more and more people marginalized and excluded. That is genuinely frightening, and that's happening right now. Now, when you propose something different and something unfamiliar to people, you're asking people to expend mental effort to get their heads around what you're saying. It doesn't matter what the topic is. And many people really don't want to go there, because it's a bit like saying to someone, you've got to sprint 100 meters, because the mental effort is quite similar, actually, in terms of the way the body perceives the need to do it as the physical effort that you would have to do that. And so it's perceived as pain. This person is inflicting pain on me, regardless of what the message is. The very fact that you're coming up with something that's completely different and completely new, or if it is, and requires that mental effort of me, is an infliction of pain. Therefore, this person is my enemy, and this person is trying to repress me. And that so often is the sequence that I see playing out when I introduce a new idea, and suddenly I get all these sort of wild accusations. Oh my God, am I really a devil worshipper who wants to kill all the firstborn? I don't remember reading that in my report, but that's how people perceive it, because you're asking for that mental effort. And so that's the first barrier before you even get to the substance of what you're trying to convey. And then you've got the barrier of this temporarily embarrassed millionaire situation where, we all think we're going to make it. Somewhere in the back of people's minds is, eventually one day I'll win the lottery, or something will come good, or I'll be digging in my garden and I'll find a crock of gold. Something will change, and suddenly I'll go from being this marginalized, excluded person to being this rich person, and then I want all that stuff that they've got, and I'll be able to get it. And that's a dream, the American dream, but it's also everyone's dream, really. I mean, perhaps it's more extreme in the US, but where it actually has a name, the American dream, that everyone's going to make it. Now, as a hope, I persuaded people in the talk, everyone is not going to make it, because it is physically impossible for everyone to make it. That's the fundamental lie at the heart of capitalism. It's why people buy into capitalism, because they think they are going to make it alongside those who've already made it. It's just not going to happen for the great majority of people. But almost the most radical thing we need to change is that belief that we can all acquire private luxury. We just cannot. It's simply impossible. And I think when people have recognized that and seen that this system is not going to deliver for them unless they win the lottery, which, and the chances of winning the lottery are the chances of winning the lottery. They're very, very remote. And so people have to sort of recognize that is just not going to deliver. And then we can start asking the question, okay, what system is going to deliver better?
Thank you. George, did you have another question you wanted to ask?
The G's mixed up again. Well, that's okay. One, yes, I do. And I guess, George, I'm intrigued by the concept of the 15-minute city. And it raises some questions. And once again, as an organizer at an organization, Boston Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, that was an amazing, or is an amazing organization that was able to use community land trust to sort of be the centerpiece of their revitalization strategy that turned conventional planning on its head, right? But here's the thing: we understood that, and from experience, that we could direct housing, we could plan housing, right? And community was involved there, and say this is the kind of housing and where it's going to be. When we got to the challenge of trying to then put in place an economic development strategy, it wasn't nearly as easy. Obviously, we can't dictate what types of commercial, private, companies or businesses will come into your community. And we, there still is, as people talk about. I have a dear friend who doesn't like the term food desert. She calls it food apartheid, because the desert sounds like it's a natural phenomenon, but this is not a natural phenomenon. It's a conscious effort. But I'm wondering the work that anyone's done to try to sort of capture what are sort of the critical elements that would make a 15-minute city work. And I'm sure it varies. And maybe the question I'm asking is the process. that you would sort of determine what are the key entities, businesses, institutions? What's the mix that would say, I've got a 15-minute city and people are pretty comfortable that they can navigate this and meet most of their needs? And do you have examples or just kind of a sense of how that could get done?
Well, I think Jodie got it right, because this is a question that I should be asking you. So you're the guy with the experience. But I mean, there's a fantastic example here in the UK, and I'm sure you know of plenty in the US, in Granby in Liverpool, which is an area which was totally derelict. I mean, all the houses were boarded up. Last time I went there, before it got transformed, there were literally weeds growing out of the paving stones up to your waist. It had just been, no one cared about it. Everyone just wrote it off. It just got completely neglected. And local people, run by a couple of inspirational women, amazing local people, just said, we're not going to put up with this any longer, and came up with some really interesting plans, which I would misrepresent if I tried to summarize them here, but check them out. Granby in Liverpool got the houses reoccupied. Basically, sort of said, right, let's do these houses up so people can live in them and hardly have to pay, and built gradually a thriving community, which then attracted businesses. And then you got this sort of market revitalized, the street markets was revitalized, you got the small businesses coming in. And there is an element of build it and they will come that I'm sure you've seen in your work.
Yes.
And of course, what we find is that when community is weak and unloved, and there's and people have very little voice, then what you get are the betting shops. You get the betting shops, you get a few fast food joints, and you get nothing else. But where the love is there, and people are able to articulate their needs, and actually create the physical environment, which is it actually says to a trader, this is going to be a nice place for me to live, because traders have souls too, and so I want to put down feet here. But B, actually there's a community of people who might want what I got to sell. Well, then at least there's an opportunity there which might not have been there before. But I know I'm telling you stuff which much better than me. So. Yeah,
I just wanted some affirmation there, right, from coming from you. But yeah. I will say this: one of the exercises that we did at Dudley Street that got to that, interesting enough, was that we wanted to explore, thanks to the Schumacher Center, at that time it was the Schumacher Society, we wanted to explore what the potential we had for creating a local currency. And in the process of trying to figure out what a local currency worked, we started saying, well, you need an ecosystem of businesses and institutions, right? Because it's not going to work if people can't use it and buy what they need and sell what they. So that really became sort of a little bit of a catalyst for us to sort of say, here's a process or an activity that was fun, non-intimidating, and we sort of went through that. And we actually, subsequently, we kind of put together, and I did this recently, sort of almost like a periodic table elements, but talked about what are the critical elements that need to be in place. So yes, there are some examples, and I think that it is an exciting concept. I'm sure demographics can, you can account for aging populations and how it could still be a 15-minute, but I love the concept, and thank you for bringing that up. And I hadn't heard of it, so I appreciate your introducing it.
Well, thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
So Greg, I wonder also if you and George could talk about like the Common Ground Trust and the U.S. Community Land Trust. Like, what are the similarities or differences, or what could one learn from another?
Well, that's definitely George's bailiwick. Well,
well, I would say actually the similarities are stronger over here with the idea of a community land trust, where we've. At the moment we have housing co-ops, we have community housing groups. What we're trying to introduce more and more is the element of community land trust, where a community acquires the land and has rights over that land, and that those rights are shared amongst the members of the community. Now, in Scotland, interestingly, which is really going in a very different direction to England, probably will leave the United Kingdom before very long, I expect, and rejoin the European Union in its own right. we've seen significant land reform, and one of those reforms is the community right to buy. And so the government of Scotland has said, if land comes up for sale, the community gets first refusal on that land and has the right to decide whether or not it wants to buy that land before anyone else can come in and bid. Now, the weakness of that is that the land is expensive and the communities tend to be poor. And so one of the things that we call for in our report is a community land fund to make it much easier for people to buy that land. And in fact, we identified some pots of money which already exist, which could be used for that purpose. We'd also like to see a much wider right of communities, particularly to buy vacant and derelict land that isn't for sale. And so that would mean the use of compulsory sales orders. So when you live in a community and every day you're walking past some hoardings and there's an empty site behind them which just hasn't been used for 10 years, for 20 years, and it's just a blight on your community, and you've got all these plans for what you can do with it, at the moment you're powerless. There's nothing you can do. Though it could completely transform your whole neighborhood to turn that into a community garden or a community housing co-op or a playground, a park, whatever it might be, but you can't do anything. So I think, when land has been left vacant like that and derelict for a certain amount of time, the community should have the right to buy it through a compulsory sales order or purchase order, depending on what you want to call it, and set up a community land trust to manage that land. And so what we're trying to do here is to, A, introduce the notion of community right to buy to the other 4 nations of the United Kingdom, in other words, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but B, to extend that into the idea of one, providing funding to make it a reality, and 2, allowing people to buy land which isn't currently for sale.
And that is perfect, because at Dudley Street, again, I'm using this as an example, but it was a community that was burned to the ground, arson for profit, when the low income community, and it was derelict, vacant, abandoned land. It was so desperate that the residents were able to convince the mayor of Boston to grant the community the power of eminent domain over all abandoned vacant land. So here's the problem with that is, and it was successful. The community really, the new homes built, we had extraordinary results, but we had to use extraordinary means in order to realize them, which wasn't a replicable model. That is the power of eminent domain, the community right to buy. Now you're talking about, okay, and with a positive example of what happens if you do grant this power and then use the community land trust, in which, by the way, the community land trust was the vehicle that also allowed the community to avoid one of its worst fears, and that is that we are going to gentrify our community and then we're going to be displaced. Certain people will be displaced. And so it was always coupled together. Gentrification, displacement seemed to be this this coupled phenomenon that you couldn't break apart, but they said we can, because we can actually lower the value that make it unattractive for speculators to come in and buy. But they had to make a conscious decision, right? There was a value proposition there in terms of a poor community. This is their source of wealth. They put the community wealth and well-being ahead of individual, right? Well, because again, they could have said, no, I'm going to put let the biggest, bigger bidder come in and I'll sell. So the value proposition there was like so critical, but it worked. And so I do think, that now if we can sort of take some of the concepts that have been developed elsewhere and use them as ways of replicating, that's very powerful. Very powerful.
Brilliant. That's such a great example, and I would love to read more about that. Thank you.
You will.
And I think a lot about what you've been talking about in this sharing of stories goes to we need examples.
Yeah.
Because when you can show an example, then we don't have the fear. It doesn't feel like you're going to have to lift 5,000 pounds. It actually looks beautiful, and you can walk across that bridge. One of the things that we were working on with Sally Calhoun, who was also one of last year's lecturers, was having people with wealth who have too much land give their land to communities. And the interesting way was we brought everyone together and said, what are you going to do with your land? And they're like thinking in the brain of capitalism. Oh, well, I got to do this and do that. And like, I got to get a return on investment. And then when we introduced the idea, but what if you gave it to the community? And we brought up examples of where that had happened. And they were just like, wow, that sounds way better than like money in the bank. That sounds like real and enriching and nourishing. And so now someone has given a plantation to Black farmers. So, as a way of expression, but it brings up one of the questions, which is, what role does racism and sexism play in land ownership? And what place do we see reparations playing in these new forms of common ownership?
Thank you. Well, it's really great to hear about that. I mean, I'm always slightly wary of philanthropy as being a sort of substitute for rights, substitute for justice. It's great to see philanthropy like that in action. Really, I want the rich people to pay their taxes so that we can decide how the money is used. And what we often find is that what philanthropy does is to focus on certain issues which are of interest to the very rich people, which might not be what the community needs. It might not be what the excluded people need. They might be the wrong issues. In fact, very often they are the wrong issues. And why are people so phenomenally rich that they can make these decisions, that they can decide what is given and what is not given and how things should develop? Well, basically because they're not being taxed enough. And given that these are finite resources that we're looking at, this is a finite world with finite resources, and we should be taxing people a lot more for the use of those resources. And then we can use that money, because I want a lot more of that money to go to the community, rather than all being centralized. Some of it obviously needs to be spent centrally by the state, but we need a lot more of that money going to the community, so the community can use that money to make its own decisions. And I think that's really fundamental. And now I've forgotten the actual question you asked. Sorry, Jodie.
But that was excellent. Thank you so much. What role has racism and sexism played in ownership?
I'm so sorry. Yes.
And what place do you see reparations?
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I got carried away. No, look, this is absolutely fundamental. How this thing we call capitalism. We say, well, it's about buying and selling, isn't it? It's about trading stuff. And actually, when you look at how people got rich, when you look at how nations got rich, it was not through buying and selling stuff. It was not through trading stuff. It was through grabbing stuff, stealing human beings. Africans stolen from their land, put on ships and shipped to the Caribbean and to the Americas. It was theft. It was their land was stolen. It was their resources were stolen, whether it was the timber or the ivory or the gold or the silver, whatever it was, those resources were stolen. If you look at India, the British stole $45 trillion from India at today's values. $45 trillion. When the British moved in, India was one of the richest nations on earth. When we moved out, we left it as one of the poorest nations on earth because we had looted the whole lot. It was just theft. And people say, well, yeah, but we paid for those goods. We paid for those goods out of the taxes we imposed on the Indians. So the British imposed this tax on the Indians had to pay, even very poor Indians. And then they used a small proportion of that tax to buy some of the goods from the Indians. So it's like, I'm going to pick your pocket, and then I'm going to take $10 out of your wallet and say, could I buy your watch, please? So you end up with $90 out of the 100 plus the watch. And none of that was yours before you picked the guy's pocket. So it was straightforward theft. And then the British used that money to fund its other colonial adventures, send gunships into other countries and grab their land and labor and resources. And that is the story of colonialism worldwide. It's just happened again and again. And that's a basis of the great wealth which nations acquired. And it's a basis of what we call capitalism. That's where the money came from. And now it's done by similar means. So you had the IMF and the World Bank saying, right, this debt, this international debt business means that you've got to open your economy to foreign investors, which all sounds neutral and benign, doesn't it? But the reality is that those so-called investors can move in and grab resources in a very similar way to how it happened in colonial times. And among those resources are land, which is land grabbing taking place all over the place. And the net effect of this is basically to steal resources from poor brown people and from women, because in many parts of the world, it's women who are the main agriculturalists, women who are the foundation of the core economy, but it's stealing women's resources, stealing the resources of people of color, and concentrating them in the hands of wealthy white men. That's fundamentally what has happened over the course of the last 300 or 400 years. And so addressing this issue of land, you start opening up every other issue as well. You start opening up the issue of racism, opening up the issue of sexism, opening up the issue of marginalization and exclusion, opening up the issue of distribution. That's why people get so angry and so defensive when you even mention land as a political subject.
Absolutely. And now I got my family, my grandmother made the part of the Great Migration in this country from Tennessee to Ohio. And I asked why Ohio, and they said, well, because there were trains and buses. We were in Tennessee, and we said, where in the north do they go? They didn't have a car. And we had one relative who had settled in Collinwood, Ohio, working for the railroad. So the family followed there, but of course faced all sorts of discrimination, redlining, disinvestment, funneled into particular communities. And then, my father, who served in World War II, comes back from the war, and then there's something called the GI Bill. And guess what? not available to everybody, as they say. If you were Black, you probably could not benefit from the GI Bill. And so my grandmother, who worked as a housekeeper at Statler Hilton, my grandfather worked at a bank. How she got, and it was primarily we were a matriarch. I mean, she was Big Mama, and she got the money. She bought the house, and I noticed this because we had a conversation. She never ever missed a day of work. And because there was a fear, if you fell behind one payment because these mortgages were so extortionate, you could lose your home. And the last part of the scenario that was played over and over again, you can see it in Detroit, you can see it in Cleveland, you can see it in other cities, is that then the Black communities slowly face disinvestment, right? And so here's my grandmother coming up from the South, trying to start to build wealth. And the first you think, home, right? You buy a home. That's how you start to build your wealth. And I'm going to say this, it's not so much but we still have the house. My half sister lives there, but I checked the value, her investment, building wealth, $19,000. That's that after going through all that and all that blood, sweat, and tears. But that repeats itself in Detroit. You can go to Chicago and you can see the same scenario playing itself out. So, my only thing, if I said I wish we'd had a Dudley Street that was focusing on the community wealth, not being able to guarantee anybody's individual wealth, but they could do a lot to try to preserve the community and try to ensure that sort of injustice didn't happen.
Well, this has been a great conversation, but I think we need to kind of bring it to an end. So, Greg, I want to start with you. We've talked about a lot of things. We work on these daily. Leave this audience with some inspiration of, what can we put our fingers on?
Yeah. Here's what I'm going to say, that despite what's going on in 2020, which is a year we all want to forget, I actually am an optimist. And for me, optimism stems from knowing that we have options. It doesn't guarantee that those options are going to be exercised. But if I was faced with what we're dealing with today and someone says the only toolkit you have is the SOS, the same old, that's what you get, then I'd be depressed. But I've seen firsthand and this is to me the important message, a community that was able to self-govern itself. By the way, that Dudley Street, they also set up their own form of self-governance. I love what you when George was describing the I forget what project it was, but you were careful to say that how the community you didn't talk about boundaries, you talked about how the community determined the area that they wanted to govern. And Dudley Street did the same thing. They're not an official census tract or an official. They determined this is our community. This is who we are, and they made that decision. So I guess for me, seeing that a community that everyone expected to be multicultural, Latino, African American, white, Cape Verdean, but could come together and turn a lot of professional and conventional wisdom, the dominant narrative on its head and take control. And the key was that they were able to get control of the land. And when they had control of the land, that gave them the courage and the ability to change the narrative. And I think we all need to do that and have the ability to do that. So I'm feeling very inspired by all this, and particularly by George's presentation.
Thank you so much, Greg, and I've really enjoyed and appreciated our conversation. It's been brilliant. What I want to leave people with really is this thought that it's a fallacy of every generation that we are stuck where we are. Nothing can be done to change the system. The system is as it is. People once believed that about the divine right of kings, as Ursula Le Guin pointed out. That they thought that's never going to change because that's written in the stars. It is a divine right. Kings achieve their monarchical position from God. Nothing can change that. People really genuinely believed that was immutable, unchangeable, and so the king has total power over your life. People believed it about colonialization, that, they've come and colonized this nation, we'll never overthrow them. Look, they're so much more powerful. They've got the money, they've got the guns. What can we do? It's just impossible. People believed it, some people over apartheid. We will never get justice in South Africa. It's simply too difficult. The forces we're up against are too powerful. They're arrayed too strongly against us. People believed it about democracy. 150 years ago, democracy was a dirty word in most parts of the world, where the idea that everyone should have a vote, them as well, they should have a vote, that was seen as absolutely an appalling and disgraceful and terrible idea, and it seemed impossible. Like, how is everyone going to get the vote when all the forces are arrayed against us? And then suddenly things change. You get these tipping points. Biologists call it hysteresis, as a flip from one stable system to a different stable system. And during the course of the previous stable system, it just looks impossible, hopeless. You can't get anywhere. You just can't do anything because all the forces are arrayed against you. And then suddenly, and it can happen with enormous speed, in the course of weeks, months, the situation changes and it flips from one system to another. And our role, our duty, is to be prepared, is to be ready. And we can be ready for years and years. And as the years pass, we think, I've been ready all this time, and nothing has changed and nothing can change. And then the moment comes and we step into that moment and we use all the work we've been doing during the apparently hopeless times, all the preparations that we've made, all the stories we've been telling, all the ideas we've been forming, all the examples we've been living. And we say, this is a new story, its time has come, now let's do it, and we can do it. And we've seen that happen again and again throughout history, where suddenly that moment arrives and what was impossible before becomes inexorable now. So our role at the moment, and this is a moment of great volatility. These are vociferous times when things which were previously set in stone suddenly are labile once more. Our duty now is to develop those new stories, develop the narrative. I'm so glad and grateful that Greg brought up this issue of narrative at the beginning because it's absolutely crucial. Develop the brilliant new examples of the kind that Greg himself has been developing, which are so powerful because they are lived examples. This is how life can be improved. Develop the arguments, develop the networks, develop the organizations, develop the mobilization, the agitation to learn, to spread, to teach the ideas, to love each other in doing so, because that's absolutely fundamental.
Absolutely.
You know, we're not going to do this through anger and hatred. We're going to do it through love, and we're going to spread that love, but we're going to spread the love with the ideas and with the knowledge, with the wisdom. It's not just love and it's not just knowledge. It's got to be both coming together. So we learn, we organize, we agitate, we develop the ideas, and we hold on in there. We're resilient, we're strong, we don't give up, however many setbacks we get, and suddenly that moment is going to come. And given the incredible shifting currents of the last few months, I suspect such a moment is just around the corner. Thank you.
Thank you. That is the vision we needed. Thank you, George Monbiot, and thank you, Greg Watson. And thank you to who have been listening to this 40th annual Schumacher Lecture and all the questions that have arisen from it.
Thank you, Jodie.
To learn more about the Schumacher Center for a New Economics, go to centerforneweconomics.org. And when you're there, you can notice at the top right hand, there's a donate button. Please feel free to be generous and pay forward today so that we can have more free events like this. The mission of the Schumacher Center is to envision a just and regenerative global economy, apply those concepts locally, and then share the results for broader replication. We hope you'll follow us on Twitter at Center4NewEcon, and make choices with your lives to create conditions conducive for life. Thank you. Bye.